Hello and welcome to Newspeak. In this, the second week of the general election. I'm very pleased to be joined, as usual, by Amy Gallagher, the campaigner behind Stand Up to Woke. Hi, Amy. And of course, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, our senior fellow and royal historian. Before we talk about various events, and some of them have been quite big this week on the election, it's been, for people who take a longer historical perspective, which we do, I think, Rafe, quite a week with D-Day, hasn't it?
Yes, very important event, probably the last D-Day's commemoration we're going to have, where the veterans of that event are actually alive today. I think only 20 veterans were able to go over to France on this occasion, compared to 255 just 5 years ago. We're at risk of D-Day falling into the annals of history, like the Boer War, for example, because we've now had a disturbing poll out showing that the majority of adults in this country don't know what D-Day is. Some confuse it with Dunkirk or with VE Day. And only a third of the youth in this country actually know what it is. And I think it's deeply saddening to hear that. I've been attending D-Day commemorations since I was 8 in 1984. And I think it's so important because by honouring these soldiers, we're actually, by commemorating these events, we're honouring the sacrifice that they made. These chaps gave their today for our tomorrow, and they sacrificed their lives in order to give us the freedoms that we enjoy today. And I think too few people alive today realise the hard-won struggles that were fought to get those rights and freedoms and secure them. And I think it's quite sad. And you have to wonder, what is their legacy? How many of those veterans are proud of the Britain of today? And what are we doing actually to live up to the legacy that they left us in terms of preserving freedom and fighting for what's right in this world? I don't know. I got quite melancholy actually about the whole thing.
Yes, it obviously means a lot to you, so.
Yeah, it was quite meaningful, I think, to see the royals come out for it as well. They're looking quite saddened by it. Prince William was there, and King Charles, and Nigel Farage has been using this as part of his campaign, hasn't he? And saying that a lot of young people don't know about D-Day, and as Rafe says, this might be the last generation. If anything, it feels like these things will be more and more forgotten as they go on, but they already are forgotten, by a lot of people. It does feel quite meaningful, it's just...
Yeah, I wonder what it is they think they're watching then when they do see depictions of D-Day in films, for example. We've had a few recently, haven't we? And in some ways you have to sort of thank Hollywood and for keeping this going.
I wonder how many children actually do watch those sorts of things. That's the thing. What is the audience for a film like Dunkirk, for example, or D-Day was Saving Private Ryan at Omaha Beach, which was the worst of the beaches there. And I guess the ultimate issue here is, as I said in the chapter for my book State of Emergency, the title was A Nation Ignorant of Its History is Like a Man with No Memory. And you can't be an engaged and informed citizen of the modern world if you don't know how the world around you came to be. And most importantly, if you don't know how hard the struggle was to get us the rights and freedoms that we enjoy today. And a lot of this blame goes on the education system. We only teach history to the age of 14, and that's hardly enough to get the broad sweep of British history, particularly when you're also being taught about Mayan civilizations and Islamic civilizations and others in there. So I think the problem is really with the lack of education.
Yes, actually, on that point, today there was a poll came out, which I think, is alarming. Say that as though we're not, that we're surprised. I suppose you shouldn't be. 54% of young people now think that Israel should not exist. Have you seen this, Andy?
No, I haven't heard of that.
This is just out. I find that quite horrifying.
I don't find it surprising in the slightest.
Horrifying.
But we've known this for a few months now in terms of the age demographic. It's people over 60 who are most supportive of Israel, and those in their 20s and below who are least supportive, and indeed who want the state of Israel to be abolished. And a lot of it is down to plain old ignorance. I just saw a thing the other day a video where they were in America, where they were asking two sort of gay rights activists who were marching for Palestine, did you know that you would be put to jail or murdered for being gay there? They had no idea, and they said, well, isn't it the same in Israel? And they said, well, no, it's not actually. Their biggest gay pride is in Tel Aviv, in the region. And it's that level of ignorance, I think, that is behind so much of this. But in a way, you can't even blame these kids, because they've been brainwashed from the age of 7 to 21 throughout their education system. They're being taught by a teaching profession that is over 90% left-wing. And increasingly, we're seeing teachers becoming political activists in the classroom. And so you even have scout groups teaching the scouts how to cheer for Intifada. That's the world we're in now.
The thing is, actually, with this particular one about Israel, you can't help thinking that this is what you get when you cross indoctrination with demographic change. Because, you know, the level of demographic change amongst young people, of course, is the most, you know, it's the sharp end of it, isn't it?
Yeah, well, this is the thing with this D-Day stuff. I mean, the BBC have been putting out some stuff about D-Day, but to me, it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, because it goes against much of their kind of more normal narrative, which is attacking our history, attacking our culture. And it almost doesn't quite sit right, actually, that the BBC would want to, you know, be sort of kind of pro D-Day. And as you say, that it's such it's a completely different world now. The idea of kind of patriotism and fighting for your country, it seems so at odds with the current kind of issues that we're dealing with, that a lot of young people hate this country but hate the West more generally. So why, in a sense, why would they be interested in D-Day? Because they've been told for so long that, you know, everything this country's done is awful and wrong.
I suppose, yes. I suppose with D-Day, yes, with the Israel thing, it was the fact that they thought it shouldn't exist. That's what alarmed me. It wasn't just that we support Israel in this conflict, or we support Gaza, you know, genocide and all of that. It was actually that they thought, because you sort of think, does this mean, if this is a general direction of travel, does this mean that Israel might not exist actually in 50 years' time, the way things are going? You know, it's extremely worrying. On this point about D-Day and not knowing, Nigel Farage has actually pointed this up, hasn't he, this week? Yeah. It is his kind of territory, and of course he's now planted himself right at the centre of this election campaign. Were you surprised by it? I
was surprised, actually. I mean, he's made quite a quick turnaround. I mean, it was only last week we were discussing the fact that he said he didn't want to be involved in British politics and he wanted to be more focused on America. I don't quite know what's happened in the last week or so, but he did announce that not only is he running as an MP for Clacton, but he has become the leader of Reform, and that this isn't just for this campaign, this is for the next 5 years. So a very significant, you know, thing for Nigel Farage to announce. I feel quite energised by it, to be honest. I thought it was very exciting. He gave a very good speech. He did speak about immigration and you know, all the issues that we talk about here on this
D-Day as well.
Yeah, D-Day. And yeah, I mean, he's saying that, you know, that all the sort of things that we say, that the two main parties have totally let everyone down, and that Reform want to become the sort of opposition to Labour in a way that the Tories can't. In a sense, they want to sort of overtake the Tories. I mean, this is very ambitious, but he's saying we want to become the serious opposition. And yeah, good luck to him.
Yeah, it was interesting actually. I can't help feeling that he did think he'd made some kind of error in actually making that. It was a rather ham-fisted statement, wasn't it? The one, I'm going off to America to basically to greater things, is what it was.
It reminded me of when he resigned from UKIP, when you were deputy leader of UKIP, so quickly after the election, thinking it had all been sorted, and then of course had to come back. I think he was very wrong-footed here. I actually do give more credence now to what he said at the time, which was that one of the reasons for calling an early election was because they were worried about him potentially, and I think he had a game plan. And Sunak's early election destroyed that game plan. He was wrong-footed, and that's why he came out with that cack-handed statement. I think this means, and I think he just admitted it, that if he does become an MP for Clacton, he won't be able to take part in Trump's election campaign as much as he was, which was the justification not for standing. But I think this is great news. I mean, for one thing, it's going to turn a very dull, dreary and vapid election into something a lot more interesting, and he'll be the vehicle by which we can finally get some of those issues into the mainstream discourse, which until now hasn't been achieved so much. And look, let's just face it, you know, Nigel Farage is the most consequential and influential politician of the last 30 years. He managed to get us a referendum without having a seat in Parliament. And the reality is, although our viewers at home are very aware of the Reform Party, a vast swathe of this nation don't know anything about the Reform Party. And it will only take Nigel Farage to actually make them aware that there is an alternative for their protest vote to come in. Now, 3 or 4 weeks may not be a great deal of time to get that message out, but still, nevertheless, having him there, my prophecy last time we spoke was that there would be 100 seats for the Tory party, a tiny rump. I'm sticking to that, but I think it may even go down to 80 now that Farage is on board. So I'm going to say 80 to 100 seats for the Tories, with Farage leading Reform.
You want to stick your head above the parapet and give us a...
I don't think it would be that bad for the Tories. I think it might be more like 120 seats for the Tories. So yeah.
You said it had energised you.
Yeah.
You see, that was what I felt, and I think it's crucial, this point, that you make about it's just simply going to bring issues into this campaign. We've been talking, past couple of days about our pledges, for example, and there is virtually no talk. There has been no talk, and you can be assured that they will try not to have any talk on these really big issues like immigration and free speech. They will not get away with that now. It'll be right in the middle. So even whatever you think of reform, when you're on social media, I don't know if you find this, when you're on Twitter, people are very purist, and they say, oh, the problem with this, mark my words, is that it's got no this, it's got no that. They fundamentally don't understand, that often it's just by introducing something, even if it were to actually sort of come to nothing after at the election's end, a seed will have been planted.
Yeah. And haven't we said all along at the New Culture Forum that immigration must be the central, at the forefront of this election campaign, and a party that was just a single issue party, calling itself the Immigration Party, would, I think, do far better than having a more complicated manifesto. So my message to the Reform Party, all those who are, if Ben or Richard or Nigel are watching, is to ditch this net zero policy that they have at the moment, which is one in, one out, and basically call for a much more drastic reduction in gross migration, because too much of this discussion and debate that we've had, and which Nigel has taken part in, has been about net migration figures. And net migration is essentially the gross figure, all those who come, and then you subtract other people who've left. But of course, those who are leaving the country aren't the same as those who are arriving here. There's white flight, there's talented people going back to Europe, pensioners going to Spain, others going to Canada and America and Australia, who are British born. And those who are coming here don't have the same cultural connections. Many are culturally incompatible. And there's too much focus on this net migration, which is an economic argument, rather than the cultural argument. And it's that cultural argument of the 1.2 million arrivals that would resonate most with the voting public who are concerned about this. And I think there's a great opportunity there if reforms go about it the correct way.
Actually, it's interesting because when Nigel was interviewed about this, he kind of, he stumbled a little bit. It's almost because it's a bad policy to have to explain. If anything, the STP, which you're a member of, aren't you?
Yeah.
STP have got the right one, which is a total freeze.
Yeah,
generational maybe?
5-year pause completely on immigration.
Completely, and then obviously work it out from there. Whereas Reform say 1 in, 1 out. We all know what that means: 400,000 in, 400,000 out. But a freeze. They also say a freeze. What is this? A freeze on what then?
Yeah,
well, starting with a freeze.
Yeah, I don't know what that freeze means at all. No. But the lunacy of this is the more people that leave this country, the more the net migration figures goes down. So the more British-born people leave, thinking this country is going to the dogs, the more who arrive there. You won't understand that if you look at the net migration figure. You could have 1 million people leave and 1 million come in, and you will have a zero net migration figure.
You also have an airport, basically.
Yeah, this is the only concern with Reform, and maybe even Nigel Farage, is that they don't always seem to get the cultural side of things. They don't necessarily seem to understand what we're facing. Sometimes they do, but you get the sense that they focus a lot on economics a bit more. In terms of it being a kind of an immigration party, I think I know people that are already saying that sort of the Nigel Farage party, that this is what this party is now, and people know what he stands for. So it may be that people can just get behind him in the way that they would do with a party called the Immigration Party, because I think people know that what Nigel Farage is about and what he, you know, his concerns about immigration and so on. And maybe you don't need to necessarily explain the nitty-gritty, but for those of us who are, you know, very political, it's concerning that the policy doesn't necessarily match up with what we think Farage would stand for, and I think they're going to have to do something about that if they're going to make this the centre of their campaign, and if he's going to be the leader for the next 5 years, they've got to get that issue really right.
Yeah, no, I think it's. I would have thought the first priority, actually, you know, change it, you know, but don't keep trying to explain this, because actually you're going to come a cropper, you know, because people are going to say, well, actually, really, what that really means is you're okay with a massive change in the population, as you've said. Thing is about Farage, in relation to this, and Thatcher was the only other one I can think of who had it, was that people, I mean, there are people I know, sort of like personal friends, things like that, they had a sigh of relief when this announcement came, and they thought, oh, fine, because they feel that he understands and they feel that they know instinctively what he thinks about things.
Yeah.
You don't get that with any of the others, do you?
No, people have gone on a journey with Nigel Farage. You know, they've seen him, you know, through Brexit, and then he's been on reality TV, he's been on GB News. People think of him like they know him, and they know what his instincts are, they know what he stands for. Like I said, you even don't need to say immigration, you can just say Nigel Farage, and people know what that means. You're not going to get that with Richard Tice or even Reform. People say, well, you know, what's that? But with Nigel Farage, you do.
Do you know, there's one thing that struck me today, since they're already starting, there was some character in the Daily Telegraph, don't recognise the name actually, but anyway, saying, presumably a Tory, saying that actually Nigel Farage is about to make a massive strategic error, and that basically they should link up in some shape or form, wasn't it, with, or stand by, or whatever, stand aside with the Conservatives. And I just thought, you're already saying this?
I mean, I've had a few of these discussions actually. His argument was, there's a risk here that Labour will be in for 2, if not 3 terms. Well, I'm sorry, even if Reform stood down all of its candidates, that wouldn't change that reality. That's the first thing, so, right? And they said, oh, well, maybe Reform should just have a deal with the Tories, that these Tory candidates will fight for Reform Party issues. Well, I'm sorry, they tried that 5 years ago, right? Then Nigel stood down his candidates, assuming that the Conservative Party would actually be going along a Reform a Brexit Party type of manifesto plan. You can't trust the Tories, I'm afraid to say. You know, they say whatever they can to get elected. Once they're elected, they forget all of their commitments until another 5 years are up, and then you hear the same hollow promises again. So you can't trust them. The reality is the Tories have to get the bloodiest of all noses. It's only if they have an existential crisis where right-wing Tory MPs who are careerists find themselves kicked out of Parliament and eager to get back in. That's the only way you can get reform there. I had this discussion with a Tory candidate just yesterday, actually, and he said, oh, well, we need to have some of our chaps in Parliament, you know, because those most likely to stay are going to be the wet, left-leaning Tories, so it'll be very difficult to reform the party. I said, no, because if we keep giving you chaps chances, nothing will change. Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different result. But whereas Dr. Johnson said, why so? When a man knows he's going to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully. And that's what we need to have here. We need the Tories out in the wilderness so that they can finally regroup, either die or reform through some sort of merger with Reform.
Absolutely. It felt to me, that article, a bit like someone committing suicide determined to take someone down with them, you know? That's how it sort of felt. And it was sort of quite ridiculous, I thought. But I think what also was in the Telegraph today, we do look at other papers, I have to say, apart from the Telegraph, was, you know, that now, and journalists are very keen to do this, aren't they? We're now a sort of set of different tribes. Now, often in elections in the past, they've had, was it Portdown Man, or was that actually a thing? There was sort of like Liverpool woman. You know, there was this kind of profile of a voter. They have actually said there are 6 now. Play a little game if you like. But Amy, you've, with a great presence of mind, wrote them down because I can't actually remember.
Yes.
I do know. What have you got there? What are the 6? See if where you identify viewers.
Yeah, so this is from a think tank, the National Centre for Social Research. And the first one that they outlined was Middle Britons. This has got the biggest percentage, so 25%, which is essentially people that are hard to win over, don't often vote, have no political affiliation, and are quite typical of the middle of politics, which I find interesting because I don't entirely know what the middle of politics is anymore.
Well, it's royal family, isn't it? I mean,
so?
they can't vote and everything. They're in the middle.
Yeah, so Middle Britons. And then you've got well-off traditionalists, which are 12%. And these are mostly conservatives who live in rural areas and are, as the title says, quite well off, and they tend to vote conservative. And then you have apolitical centrists who are also not very engaged in politics. This is 17%. They're to the right of economics, but they're kind of centre on social issues. So they're not that different from the Middle Britons, which if you look at it, you've got about 40% there that actually just aren't interested in politics and sort of aren't that engaged. And then you've got left behind patriots, which make up about 15%. These are people that mostly voted Brexit, are basically conservative on most issues, and would probably more likely to vote for reform than any other party.
So where does Miss Gallagher
I
sit
would probably be a left behind patriot.
Yeah, but you see, the thing is, can I just make a point here? The fact is, you're obviously not left behind. This is the thing, when they used to talk about left behind, when Clacton was a typical left behind place apparently, but to me it was always, well, a bit insulting, but also a bit of a misnomer, because, when I say you're not left behind, you're successful, all of this, and yet you voted for Brexit. So I'm just wondering, Rafe, give us a clue.
To second syllable sounds like it's well. I would say I'm also a cross between well-off traditionalist and left behind patriot. Going simply by
equally, you're not left behind.
No, but you see, don't get too caught up on the actual on the names of these things, because it says here this of left behind patriots. This group are patriotic, mostly voted for Brexit, are opposed to economic inequality. Now, there's the economic inequality. I don't know how many of the well-off traditionalists are actually lean slightly to the left on economics. I believe in sort of a Swedish, Danish sort of a market-based social democracy. And so that's where I think where a lot of the differences come, because we know most of the nation actually leans slightly to the left on economics, slightly to the right on social issues. So I would associate most with the well-off traditionalists, but actually I have a lot of common ground with the left-behind patriots.
It's interesting, though, isn't it, in terms of influence? I mean, here we are sitting on this, very well followed channel and everything. So you say, well, you've got influence and everything. But the fact is that some of those groups have hugely disproportionate influence.
Yeah. So the two remaining groups. So there's the urban progressives, which only make up 16%, and these are the university educated, essentially lean left on everything, on economics.
Well, they all work at the BBC.
Yeah. I mean, this is what I guess largely we describe as kind of the metropolitan liberal elite that we are often critical of on this show. But as you said, they get, they're very loud, but they're only 16% of the according to this, of the electorate. And then there's also the soft left liberals, which make up 14%, that are kind of on the centre of economics, but probably more to the left socially. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the biggest thing is that a large portion of the electorate aren't interested in politics and potentially don't want to vote. I mean, we often talk about people shifting tribes, people voting Labour, voting Conservative, or people used to vote Conservative, voting Reform. But actually, I think all the things everything that all the main political parties should be thinking about is getting to people that otherwise don't vote to vote. I saw this in the mayoral election where I stood, is that a lot of people criticise the smaller parties for splitting the vote. But actually, you want to get people to vote for you that wouldn't ordinarily vote for the larger parties, who wouldn't vote in general.
Yeah, I think it's also the point that it's 15% for left behind patriots, 15%. Yeah. That also chimes in with this kind of level of people who, what you might call, like people who would have been very angry about COVID and the restrictions. The demonstrations we saw. We filmed this demonstration in London on Saturday for a forthcoming programme we're doing. and we filmed there. And I would say, broadly speaking, they were left behind patches. But then you sort of think, well, actually, what is the upper ceiling on those people? I mean, I'm thinking of the reform vote. So.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the only group likely to vote reform in this group are the left behind patriots. And yet, if they're 15%, reform's polling higher than that, right?
Yes,
and reform, they could easily, with hard work, get to 25%. So there is crossover with the well-off traditionalists there, right? Too, I would say.
But when people say left behind, I'm assuming they mean economically left behind. I mean, am I right? I mean, I've always thought it meant people in burnt out, towns with no industry anymore and coastal resources.
Yeah, but I think these days it even goes further than that. It's just don't feel that this is their country any longer. Don't feel that they fit in any way. I mean, we all relate to that. This is what we all talk about because we feel that's exactly that same sort of thing. That society, this is no longer the country that they were born in or recognize in any way.
Speaking of which, I mean, it does sort of dovetail into a wider discussion, which is what I just wanted us to talk about now. It's an article that was on a site called The Free Press, which I think is American, and it's by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's a hugely respected campaigner and writer, Somalian born. She now lives in America. She's the wife of Niall Ferguson, and she's spoken out always about Islam and radical Islam, but both, I would add. She's written this overview of what the hell is going on, and basically people who get in touch with us all the time, they always ask the questions, what's going on, how does this happen, and who's behind it, where are we going, and everything. She gives an absolute breakdown, doesn't she? And she lays it, on the shoulders of a number of different people. What it amounts to, is it not, Amy, to start with you, is that she's talking about a revolution, right? And there are 4 stages in that revolution, and it starts with demoralization, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Then destabilization, and then we have crisis,
and then normalization.
Right?
So this comes from a former Soviet, I think he was a KGB agent and writer and thinker, Yuri Bezmenov, who outlined this.
Bezmenov.
Yeah, and she's kind of saying that this is quite true and this is what we're going through. The demoralization happens over a period of kind of 10 to 30 years, when essentially a culture or a nation are repeatedly told that made to feel that their culture isn't worthwhile, made to lose confidence in themselves, made to give up all the values and beliefs that they ordinarily would hold, and that's kind of inverted. And then after that long period of demoralization, you get a kind of a sudden burst of revolution. And that's the destabilization that she talks about, in that suddenly everything's up for grabs and nobody, anything can happen. And she was saying in this article that she feels that she has watched the West go through this kind of period of demoralization, and actually it was kind of, everybody will have a different perspective on this, but she cites the COVID pandemic in terms of the extreme authoritarian rules and lockdown alongside the Black Lives Matter protest, and then more recently this explosion of what you were talking about previously, of people suddenly announcing that they don't believe the state of Israel should exist, or being openly anti-Semitic and waving Palestine flags, and everybody some of us thinking, where has this come from? We didn't realise so many people were anti-Semitic. She cites that as kind of being the signs of that we're moving from the demoralisation to the destabilisation period. She's just highlighting this as a kind of a plan of what's happening. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what both of you think. I mean, I would say probably we are in that phase now, but you could also say
we are in the
destabilisation phase. But you could also argue that we've gone through the crisis and maybe we're at normalisation now, because there are so many things like the anti-Semitism that we're seeing that are now just go under the radar and are seen as normal. But she's very concerned, about communism and Islamism and those two things coming together.
That's right. There's basically American Marxists are basically the basis of this. Islam or Islamism does she say?
I think she says Islam.
Islam, yes, and then
political Islam.
Yes, and then also, our old friends, the Chinese Communist Party. Does this ring as true to you as it does?
Well, I've been saying for years that we're now in a post-revolutionary society, so it chimes in very well with exactly what I've said. And, Bezmenov, I've long spoken about it. I wrote about him in our last book as well. And he talks all about this, media, culture, education. This is all part of the long march through the institutions. You demoralize a society by focusing on their students, because that is those 25 years, that generation. And if you bombard them with enough information, he says, for example, you can tell them how wonderful communism is and bombard them with this stuff. Then if you took them to Siberia, to a gulag, and actually showed them, they wouldn't believe it, because they've been so indoctrinated. And that's what we're seeing as a result with the youth of today. And it's quite correct to call this American Marxism. And I think actually increasingly we should get away from calling things woke and use this term of American Marxism. I mean, American Marxism actually came from the Frankfurt School and from the Italian communists originally, but in its current form, it is the greatest threat to Western civilization. And, people think about Marxism as an economic model. And James Lindsay writes about this very well, spoke about this. He referred to Marxism as being a genus, like a cat. You have lions, you have tigers, you have tabby cats and letters and cheetahs. Those are all subdivisions of a cat. And same thing with Marxism. You have economic Marxism, which is the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, which is an attack on capitalism. But then you have radical feminism, which is an attack on masculinity. Then you get critical race theory, which is another form of Marxism, which is an attack on whiteness. Then you have queer theory, which is another form of Marxism, which is an attack on heterosexuality. And then you get the decolonization movement, which is an attack on the West. And you add all of that together through intersectionality, and you have the erosion of our entire civilization. And then add to that the fact that Marxists are also atheists, and of course you have the erosion of the church. So I think it's about time we did speak about it in those Marxist terms. What the left like to do is they like to say, oh, well, cultural Marxism is an anti-Semitic term. A lot of rubbish and nonsense. Nothing to do with that at all. We need to call a spade a spade.
Actually, that's the point, because we used to quite freely call it cultural Marxism. It hadn't even occurred to me that this was some kind of... but apparently it's a bit like using the term cosmopolitan. Apparently that is kind of a dog whistle for Jewish.
I drink them all the time.
Yeah, well, but I mean, this is, I think, very, very important. I think throughout the whole article, which please do read if you can. It's on the Free Press. I don't know, you can pick it up on social media. There was no paywall. But it seems to me that she has entirely got a grip of what is actually happening in America. We're talking about America, but frankly, is there anything different about it here? I can't see anything different about it here.
No, and what she outlines as well in the article is that this is something that happens kind of under the radar, that people don't realise it's happening.
Yeah.
And I think most of us feel that there's a lot of people that just don't get it. That we can see something happening that a large section of the population don't see happening and are going along with and are still going along with. It's like people often use the metaphor of a frog slowly boiling in water as the heat gets turned up. They don't realise they're being boiled alive because it's so slow. But she says, that this is how it's happened, that it's gradual. And at what point do we suddenly feel that do people realise that there is a serious threat? I mean, I think people are realising it more, but there are still there was a Tory on Newsnight recently that was just saying, I don't get the whole culture wars. I don't think there's a problem.
Yes.
And that is what we're talking about, the kind of the frog that doesn't realise that something is happening.
Well, she went a bit further, actually. She was, I think she might be standing down this time, but anyway, but she was very, very typical of that kind of Tory. She was more or less saying that it was that we, not just that there isn't a culture war, but that we could do better when we're talking about LGBTQ issues, which is code basically for saying agree with us. It's a patronising way of saying it. But this is a small part of it. You're quite right. Like for example, when I saw the outright sectarianism at the local elections, that's when I felt we've moved on. Yeah. Right, we've moved on to a stage now. And Nigel, in fact, was the only politician who actually talked about sectarianism actually around that time. But you see, what are we therefore to do? I mean, we do our best with things like this. But you see, as you say, people looking for votes at the moment from us, they would just think this is the ravings of a lunatic.
I mean, people on our channel always comment and say, "Well, you chaps talk a lot. What's going to be done about it?" All we can do, all we are able to do is alert people to what's going on and try to hopefully influence in some way the discourse around all of this. And it does take something like the Reform Party to actually get a grip of this thing and use their position as a platform to let give these views greater credence and greater currency, because this is the greatest threat. This is just as big a threat as the Second World War. It's a Cold War that we're fighting, and if more people don't wake up to it, well, then it may well soon be too late.
Yes, I think the thing is, when you have like that poll about the young people thinking Israel shouldn't exist, I was sort of immediately thought, what else is coming down the line?
Yeah, how can it get? What's next?
I mean, we've had the D-Day thing. But you can sort of, not to diminish that, but you can sort of still use our frames of reference to describe why that might be. But what if some really amazing things comes down? I don't know. The world would be better off if Britain didn't exist, for example. I wonder what kind of percentage there would come with that.
Or even Britain would be better off under Sharia law, something like that.
Something like that.
But
and it is the extraordinary ignorance. Anyway, it's well worth reading. You might say, well, who knew? This is very. But nevertheless, it's always good to see it put in a modern context. Just one thing I'd add to that is that it just never does fail to astonish me that we're talking about America. I would never have thought that's where it would first, basically be so clearly, in action, and that's in America. I would have thought, like, Marx thought that Russia was going to be the last place of the revolution. You know where he thought it was going to be, don't you? Marx.
Oh, yeah, it was going to be here. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Well,
really?
the industrialized countries. Well, that was that's the whole reason for cultural Marxism, right?
Yeah.
Because of course you had Antonio Gramsci, who realized that the economic model hadn't worked because, of course, it was in feudal countries that communism has succeeded, Russia and China, and he looked at the West and thought, how can we do this? And he realized that you needed to have a cultural revolution, essentially. And then, of course, you get Marcuse and the whole Frankfurt School, where they were sitting down and working on this. The reason it went to America was because of the Second World War, because it was in the Second World War that these Frankfurt academics went over to American universities and sowed the seeds there. And then in '68, you had Roy de Duchka, who, of course, coined that phrase, the long march through the institutions, because at the same time you had the more radical communists who thought they could enact change immediately overnight through armed insurrection and terrorism. And he said, no. This is a process of decades. We must take things slowly and have a long march. And the reason that America was ripe ground for all of this was because of its racial makeup, which you didn't have in Europe. We were much more homogenous there. That's why there was no axe to grind, because the working classes of Britain were small c conservative patriots.
Yes.
And so again, as we all know, increased ethnic diversity leads to a lowering of social trust and more division within societies. And so as this country becomes more ethnically diverse, you can just expect more conflict and more strife and more tension.
What we certainly can't expect to see is this kind of issue being, discussed on the leaders' debates during the election. Speaking of which, just while we close, did you even bother to watch? I mean, and so do you have a view?
Yeah, I did watch it.
Yeah?
I mean, I wasn't impressed by either of them. I was quite surprised by how bad Starmer was. I just because he's going to probably be the next leader. I found that quite disappointing. But yeah, I mean, it would have been better to see Nigel Farage up there. That would have been, with the two of them.
He's going to do it Friday, I
believe. That'll be good. But I think both of them were it was very petty. It was very not speaking to the more serious issues. And just much of the same. They're kind of largely interchangeable, but I think Rishi's probably more polished and more experienced, so he comes across better.
He seemed to get him on a few points.
Yeah.
I just saw a few bits of it. But
yeah, I think in both cases, just reminded me of, was it Margaret Thatcher saying about Geoffrey Howe, being attacked by Geoffrey Howe is like being mauled by a dead sheep. They both seem to basically be completely uninspiring, completely devoid of any charisma, completely managerial, grey suits, and there was nothing to inspire anyone there.
God, sorry, I keep on saying we're ending, but just to mention this as well, you know, one of the lead totemic figures of the liberal elite, if you like, is Daniel Finkelstein, at the Times columnist. And he was just writing about how, I mean, talk about complacent, how this is just what we want, this kind of boring sort of technocrat. What we don't want is chaos, and chaos means Farage. Farage is the chaos candidate. You know, I just thought, how can you be so out of touch? But anyway, that's how they can be out of touch. Amy, thank you so much. Rafe, thanks so much. And well, as Shaw Taylor used to say, keep them peeled. And we shall see you next week. Thank you very much. Thank you. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.